Ava Wilson had learned long ago that life wasn't always fair, but she was determined to make the most of it. Born to circumstances that others might deem humble, Ava took pride in every small success she earned. Northbridge University was her biggest achievement yet, a prestigious institution where every step she took reminded her of how far she had come. Yet this place, with its ivy-covered walls and manicured lawns, also held darker shadows, ones that became apparent soon after her arrival. Ava was different from many of the students at Northbridge. Her path here had been carved through hard work, sleepless nights of studying in her tiny apartment, and the sacrifices of her adoptive parents. The scholarship she won was her golden ticket, a recognition of the drive and determination that defined her. Yet to some, particularly those with too much privilege and too little empathy, Ava's story was nothing more than an inconvenience, an unwanted reminder that grit and perseverance could overshadow inherited wealth. Among these privileged few were Brandon, Chris, and Luke. They had an air of entitlement, the kind that often follows boys who had never heard the word no from anyone but their nannies. Brandon was the leader, a tall, broad-shouldered young man who spoke with an authority that no one dared question. Chris, the sly one, hid behind Brandon's presence, his sharp tongue striking from the safety of the shadows. Luke, the youngest, was desperate for validation, always following Brandon and Chris's lead to fit in. Together, they were a formidable trio, feared and admired in equal measure. Ava first noticed them during orientation week. She had been trying to navigate the labyrinthine campus when she overheard them, lounging near the fountain, casually mocking a student's old sneakers. She remembered the way their laughter seemed to echo, loud, confident, designed to intimidate. She tried to ignore it, focus on the map in her hands, but it had left an impression. It wasn't long before their gaze turned to her. Ava walked into her Economics 101 class and immediately felt their eyes on her. The boys at the back row, Brandon with his feet propped on the empty chair in front of him, Chris smirking, and Luke glancing at her curiously. Ava took a seat near the front, determined to concentrate on the lecture, but the whispered remarks began soon after. "Looks like someone shopped the discount bin again," Chris murmured just loud enough for her to hear, as she passed by in a vintage sweater she had found at a thrift store. Brandon snickered, and Luke chuckled, though his laughter seemed hesitant. Ava clenched her teeth and kept walking. She was no stranger to people looking down on her, but something about their smugness felt particularly cruel. The boys weren't just rich. They were the kind of rich that made them feel invincible, as if their money could shield them from the consequences of their actions. They had everything handed to them on a silver platter, and they couldn't comprehend the idea of someone working for what they had. One cold afternoon, Ava had settled down at the library, diving into a thick economics text. It was her favorite spot on campus, a place where she could lose herself in books and forget about the looming figures of Brandon, Chris, and Luke. The smell of old paper, the soft rustle of pages, it was her sanctuary. But the peace didn't last. She looked up to see Chris leaning against the bookshelf, watching her. He had that grin on his face, the one that made her skin prickle with unease. "Studying hard, Ava? Trying to catch up to the rest of us?" he asked, his tone dripping with false sweetness. Ava set her jaw, refusing to take the bait. "Some of us have to study, Chris. Not everyone can buy their way through school." His grin faltered for a moment, then widened as Brandon and Luke joined him. Brandon sauntered over, plopping into the chair across from Ava. He drummed his fingers on the table, his gaze flicking over her books. "What's the point, really?" Brandon said, feigning interest in her notes. "You know, you could save yourself a lot of trouble if you just learned your place. Not everyone's cut out for a place like Northbridge." Ava looked him straight in the eye, her voice cold. "I earned my place here. Can you say the same?" For a brief moment, Brandon's composure cracked. His eyes narrowed, and an awkward silence fell over the group. It was Luke who broke it, his nervous laugh breaking the tension. "Come on, Brandon, let's not waste time on her." They left, but Ava could sense something in the air had shifted. She knew she had just made herself a target, but she didn't regret her words. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let a group of entitled boys push her around. But what she didn't know was how deep their malice could go. The whispers grew louder after that day. They made it their mission to unsettle her, making rude comments as she walked past in the hallway, scribbling notes and dropping them on her desk, and even tripping her once during a crowded lecture, her books scattering across the floor as they laughed. Ava would pick herself up every time, her jaw set, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry or falter. But she wasn't without allies. Ava found solace in her friendship with Rachel, her roommate, a spirited young woman who had also earned her spot at Northbridge through sheer hard work. Rachel had seen through the trio's games from day one and encouraged Ava to stay strong. "They're insecure, Ava. That's why they target you?" Rachel said one night as they sat in their dorm room, Ava's books piled between them. "You're the real deal, and it terrifies them." Rachel's support meant everything to Ava. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that for every Brandon, Chris, and Luke, there were people who saw her for her strength, not her clothes or her background. Despite this, Ava couldn't deny that the bullying was taking its toll. She'd see Brandon's condescending smile in her dreams, hear Chris's snide remarks echo in her head when she was trying to study. It was exhausting, fighting them off every day, and the weight of it began to wear her down. Then, everything changed with an unexpected invitation. One afternoon, Brandon approached her, this time without the mocking entourage. His demeanor was different, his smile almost friendly. He invited her to a party, his words casual, as if they had always been friends. Ava's first instinct was to refuse, but something in his eyes, perhaps a flicker of sincerity, or maybe just her curiosity, made her hesitate. Why the sudden change of heart? Ava asked, her gaze steady. Brandon shrugged, his voice smooth. "We figured we might have misjudged you. Come on, it'll be fun." Ava didn't trust him, not for a second, but there was something compelling about his offer. She knew it could be a setup, probably was. But another part of her wanted to confront whatever they had in store, to show them that she wouldn't run. She could handle whatever they threw at her, or so she hoped. As she stood in her dorm room that evening, staring at the simple clothes hanging in her closet, she wondered if accepting their invitation was a mistake. Rachel watched from her bed, arms crossed. "You don't owe them anything, Ava," Rachel said, her voice soft. "I know," Ava replied, "but maybe this is something I have to do." Rachel sighed, then smiled. "All right then. Let's get you ready to show those jerks who they're dealing with." And so, Ava decided she would attend the party, her head held high. She knew Brandon, Chris, and Luke were planning something, but they underestimated her resilience. Whatever game they wanted to play, Ava was ready. This time, it would be different. This time, she wouldn't let them walk away with the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Ava didn't expect her life to become a spectacle. She had no illusions about how she was perceived at Northbridge University, a scholarship student with thrift store clothes and a stubborn determination to succeed. The whispers and occasional laughs from behind had become her soundtrack, background noise that she had trained herself to ignore. But the day she received an invitation from Brandon and his clique, the familiar rhythm of her life began to change, shifting into something more uncertain and unsettling. It started innocuously enough. A regular Monday morning, students bustling through the hallways. Ava walked towards her first lecture, her mind already focused on the workload ahead, when she felt it, an uncomfortable sensation that made her skin prickle. She could feel someone's gaze fixed on her. She looked up, only to see Brandon leaning casually against a row of lockers, flanked by Luke. Chris stood just a bit behind, wearing that infamous half-smirk of his. Brandon's eyes caught hers, and he smiled, an odd, almost inviting smile, the kind that made you want to look away, but also filled you with curiosity. "Hey, Ava," Brandon called out, straightening and stepping forward, his voice much friendlier than she'd ever heard it. It caught the attention of others in the hallway, and Ava could almost hear the collective intake of breath. The infamous Brandon Lockwood speaking to Ava Wilson? The world seemed to pause. Ava stopped, her brow furrowing slightly. There was no reason for him to talk to her, and definitely not with that tone. Yet she stayed in place, her instinct urging caution while another part of her was unwilling to back away. She had faced them for months. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of running now. Brandon approached with Luke trailing behind. He wore a confident grin, but it seemed practiced, his eyes flicking briefly to his friends before resting on Ava. "Got a minute?" he asked. She didn't answer, and Brandon took that as his cue to continue. "We're having a little get-together this weekend. You should come. It's gonna be fun. Music, drinks, the whole lot. I mean, it wouldn't be a real party without the whole freshman year, right?" Ava hesitated. A get-together? A part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She had been the target of their petty taunts for weeks, and now they were inviting her as if they had always been on good terms. She didn't trust it, not for a moment. "Why me?" Ava finally asked, her voice cool. "I didn't think I was exactly your type of crowd, Brandon." Brandon's smile widened, and he stepped closer. He gave a casual shrug, as if he hadn't thought about it much, though Ava knew he had. "We might have gotten off on the wrong foot," he said, his voice dripping with casual charm. "But I think it'd be a shame for you to miss out just because of some silly misunderstandings. Besides, Luke's parents have a huge house, and we're inviting everyone worth knowing." Luke chimed in then, his smile looking a bit too eager, as if he was trying to sell the idea. "Yeah, Ava, it'll be cool. Just, come by, have fun." Ava studied their faces, her instincts telling her they were up to something. But there was something else too, a curiosity, a need to see what this so-called invitation was really about. She wasn't someone who liked to shy away, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking she was scared. "Fine," Ava said after a pause. She tilted her chin up slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I'll be there." The smirk on Brandon's face sharpened, something almost triumphant flickering in his eyes. He exchanged a quick look with Luke and Chris, who had stayed in the background, a quiet witness to the exchange. "Great. We'll see you there then," Brandon replied, giving a small wave before turning and walking away, Luke trailing after. Ava stood there, watching their retreating forms, her stomach twisting in knots. She knew it was a trap. The way they exchanged glances, the two quick smiles, the practiced charm. It all screamed of a plan already set in motion. But she also knew that if she avoided the party, it would be seen as a weakness. They would laugh, they would whisper behind her back, and it would be one more story of Ava Wilson, the poor scholarship student who didn't belong. The whispers were back the moment Brandon left, a low hum that followed her down the hallway. Ava ignored them, her head held high. But as she passed, she could see the glances, curious, surprised, a few pitying. She clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to be anyone's spectacle. If they wanted to play games, then so be it. She would see them on their terms, and she wouldn't let them win. That night, Ava told Rachel, her roommate and best friend, about the invitation. Rachel's eyes widened, and she stared at Ava like she had just declared she was going skydiving without a parachute. "Are you serious? They invited you to a party?" Rachel asked, incredulity dripping from every word. "This can't be for anything good, Ava. You know they're planning something." "I know," Ava said, her voice calm but her gaze fierce. "But what am I supposed to do, Rachel? Hide? They want me to back down, to be scared. I'm tired of them acting like they're untouchable." Rachel sighed deeply, her fingers drumming against her notebook as she considered Ava's words. "They are untouchable, though," she said finally. "They're Brandon, Chris, and Luke. They have money, connections. They don't live in the same world we do." Ava nodded, knowing her friend was right, but also knowing that she couldn't let that stop her. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I can't let them see me as a coward." Rachel stared at her, and after a long moment, her expression softened. "All right," she said, determination creeping into her tone. "If you're going, then you're going to be prepared. You'll make them regret even thinking about messing with you." The following days were a flurry of plans and whispered discussions late at night. Rachel made it her mission to ensure Ava wouldn't just attend that party, she would own it. They borrowed a dress from one of Rachel's friends, a deep blue satin number that hugged Ava's figure perfectly. They spent hours figuring out her hair and makeup, experimenting until Ava looked into the mirror and saw someone who seemed untouchable herself. "Remember," Rachel said as she adjusted a pin in Ava's hair, her voice serious, "you are not just some scholarship student. You're Ava Wilson. You're strong, and you've earned everything you've got. Don't let them forget it." Ava nodded, taking a deep breath. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew that she wouldn't be walking in as a victim. Whatever game Brandon and his friends were playing, she would face it head on. The doubt that gnawed at her was tempered by the fire in her chest, a determination that had seen her through every hurdle so far. She arrived at her father's dealership that Saturday evening, just before sunset. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with both pride and worry. He had offered to drive her himself, but Ava had refused. She wanted to walk in on her own terms. Instead, Adrian arranged for her to use one of his classic cars, an elegant Bentley, black and gleaming, a piece of history that looked nothing like the flashy modern vehicles that would surely fill Luke's driveway. "Be careful, Ava," Adrian said, his voice soft. "But don't let them intimidate you. You're my daughter, and you're stronger than any of them." Ava smiled, her heart swelling with both gratitude and determination. She had faced tougher challenges before, surviving on the streets, fighting for a future when everything seemed bleak. This was just another challenge, and she would conquer it just like all the others. As she stepped into the Bentley, her dress flowing elegantly around her, Ava took one last look at her father, nodding. She was ready to face whatever waited for her. And whatever Brandon, Chris, and Luke had planned, they would soon learn that Ava Wilson wasn't someone they could simply push around. The car moved smoothly along the tree-lined streets, and Ava could see Luke's house in the distance, a sprawling mansion lit up like a beacon. She could already hear the music, the laughter. It was a stage set for drama, and she would play her part, but on her own terms. With her heart steady and her eyes focused, Ava stepped out of the car. She wasn't just attending their party. She was walking into the lion's den, but she had brought her own fire. And the lions had no idea what they were in for. Ava Wilson had decided she was going to the party, but she wasn't going in blind. She knew the trio, Brandon, Chris, and Luke, would have some kind of scheme waiting for her, and she couldn't allow herself to be caught off guard. This wasn't just a party, it was a battleground, and Ava was determined to be ready for whatever tricks they had up their sleeves. She knew the game they were playing: power, image, intimidation, and she intended to turn their game on its head, a spark of defiance. Rachel was the first to know about Ava's decision, and her reaction was immediate, a blend of shock and admiration. They sat cross-legged on Ava's bed that night, Rachel's eyes wide as Ava recounted the hallway encounter. "So let me get this straight," Rachel said, twirling a pen between her fingers, her expression hovering between disbelief and a grin. "You're really going to their party? Like, actually walk into the lair of the entitled wolves?" Ava nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I have to. If I don't, they'll think I'm afraid, and that's exactly what they want. They've been pushing me for weeks. This is the first time I get to push back." Rachel stared at her, then let out a deep sigh, setting the pen aside. "I get it. But if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. No half measures. You're not just going to their party. You're going to blow them out of the water." Ava smiled, a flicker of fire in her eyes. "What do you have in mind?" Rachel grinned back, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Oh, Ava, you have no idea. A gown and a plan." The next day, Rachel dragged Ava across town to a small boutique on the far side of the city, a place with no flashy signs, just an elegant storefront and deep purple drapes in the window. Rachel had a connection here. Her cousin had once worked as an intern for a designer, and she knew just the place for Ava's transformation. As they stepped inside, the air filled with the scent of jasmine, the quiet hum of classical music playing in the background. Dresses in deep reds, shimmering blues, and rich greens hung along the walls, each more stunning than the last. The boutique was small but luxurious, the kind of place Ava had never dared to step into before. Ava hesitated at the door, suddenly feeling out of place. But Rachel was already pulling her forward, a wide grin on her face. "This is your night, Ava. No way are we doing this halfway." The boutique's owner, an elegant older woman named Claire, greeted them with a smile that seemed to see right through them. "Rachel, darling, it's been a while," Claire said, her eyes twinkling as she looked at Ava. "And this must be your friend. I hear we need to make quite the impression." Ava blushed slightly, but she straightened her back, refusing to be intimidated. "I need something that'll make me look like I belong," Ava said. "Or better yet, something that'll make them think twice." Claire studied her for a moment, then nodded, a knowing smile crossing her face. "I think I have just the thing," she said, motioning for them to follow her to a back room. There, hanging in a glass cabinet, was a deep sapphire blue dress. It was sleek and elegant, the fabric shimmering faintly under the lights, hugging the mannequin's form perfectly. The neckline was delicate, plunging just enough to be daring without losing its class, and the dress flowed to the floor, with a slit running up one side. Rachel's eyes widened in delight as she looked at Ava, nodding fervently. "This is it, Ava. This dress will turn heads, trust me." Ava stepped closer, her fingers brushing over the fabric. She could feel the weight of it, the power it exuded, sophisticated, confident, and strong. She nodded, a fire flickering in her eyes. "This is perfect." Claire smiled, stepping away to give Ava room to change. As Ava emerged from the fitting room, her transformation was immediate. The dress fit her like a glove, accentuating every curve while maintaining a regal elegance. Rachel let out a small gasp, her eyes shining. "Ava, you look unstoppable," Rachel said, her voice almost reverent. Ava turned to the mirror, and for the first time, she could barely recognize herself. The girl in the reflection looked powerful, someone who commanded attention without having to say a word. The uncertainty and modesty she usually wore like armor were replaced by a confidence that seemed to radiate from within. Rachel grinned as she placed her hands on Ava's shoulders. "This is it, Ava. This is the you they don't know exists." A father's pride. Ava returned home that night, carrying the dress in a garment bag and feeling the weight of the impending night settle on her shoulders. Her father, Adrian, was waiting for her in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. He looked up as Ava entered, and his eyes softened as he saw the bag she carried. "Big plans for the weekend, I take it?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ava set the bag down on the table and took a seat across from him. She hadn't told him everything. Not about the bullying or the daily comments, not wanting to worry him. But she knew he wasn't oblivious. Adrian Wilson was a man who could read his daughter like a book, and she suspected he knew more than he let on. "They invited me to a party," Ava said, keeping her tone light, but the determination in her eyes betrayed her intent. "I want to go. I need to show them that they can't push me around." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of worry crossing his face. "Ava, these boys, they don't play fair. You know that." Ava nodded, her hands clasped tightly together. "I know, Dad, but I can't back down. Not now." There was a long silence between them, the kind of silence that held 1,000 unspoken words. Adrian finally let out a sigh, his gaze softening as he looked at his daughter. "You know, I didn't raise you to be afraid," he said. "But I also didn't raise you to fight every battle alone." Ava felt a lump in her throat, and she looked down, her voice a little shaky. "I'm not alone, Dad. I've got Rachel, and I've got you and Mom." Adrian nodded, his expression filled with a mix of pride and worry. "All right, then. If you're going, let's do it right." He stood up, walking over to a cabinet in the corner, opening it to reveal a row of keys hanging neatly. He pulled down a set of keys. One's Ava recognized. It was to his prized Bentley, the vintage car that he hardly ever drove, a symbol of the success he had fought so hard to achieve. "Take this," Adrian said, handing her the keys. Ava's eyes widened in shock. "Dad, no, I can't take the Bentley." "It's too much," she protested, but Adrian shook his head, his expression firm. "It's not just a car, Ava," he said softly. "It's a statement. Let them see you arrive in that, and let them know you're not someone they can look down on." Ava stared at the keys in her hand, feeling the weight of them, the history and love behind them. She looked up at her father, her eyes misting over slightly. "Thank you, Dad." Adrian smiled, his eyes glistening. "Just remember, Ava, whatever happens, you're stronger than they'll ever be. You face more than they could ever imagine, and you've come out on top every time. You make me proud, no matter what." The calm before the storm. Saturday evening came quickly, and Ava found herself standing in her room, staring at her reflection. The dress shimmered under the soft lighting, her hair swept back elegantly. Rachel stood beside her, carefully applying the final touches of makeup, her eyes focused. "You're gonna walk in there, and they're not going to know what hit them," Rachel said, her voice full of admiration. Ava looked at her reflection, the girl staring back at her, strong, beautiful, ready. The girl who had once been too afraid to even walk by Brandon, Chris, and Luke without her heart pounding in her chest was nowhere to be found. This Ava was different, poised, confident, and prepared for whatever lay ahead. Rachel stepped back, giving Ava a small smile. "You're ready." Ava nodded, taking a deep breath. "I am." She walked outside, where the Bentley waited, the polished surface reflecting the evening sky. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation, a readiness for whatever this night had in store. The driver, a quiet older man her father trusted implicitly, held the door open for her, and Ava slipped inside. She looked out the window as the car began to move, the city lights blurring past. She knew this wasn't just a party. It was a test, a confrontation between the girl they thought they could break and the woman she was becoming. As the Bentley pulled up to Luke's sprawling mansion, Ava took one last steadying breath, her heart fierce and determined. Tonight she wasn't just Ava Wilson, the scholarship student they thought they could bully. Tonight she was Ava Wilson, the girl who would show them exactly why they should have never underestimated her. And whatever awaited her inside that house, she was ready for it. The night air was crisp as the Bentley pulled up to Luke's sprawling mansion, an architectural marvel bathed in golden light, surrounded by lush gardens and ornate fountains. Ava took a deep breath, steadying herself as the driver opened her door. She stepped out, her sapphire blue dress flowing elegantly around her, and for a moment, all eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of the stairs, curious, disbelieving, some even impressed. Ava held her head high, her eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered in front of the house. Students milled around the entrance, their laughter carrying through the air, unaware that tonight would be anything but ordinary. Ava wasn't just stepping into a party. She was stepping into the belly of the beast, and she was ready to strike. As she approached the entrance, Ava caught sight of Brandon, Chris, and Luke. They were standing by the doors, champagne glasses in hand, dressed in expensive suits that looked more like costumes than clothes. When Brandon noticed her, his confident smirk faltered for just a second, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. "Well, look who decided to show up," Brandon called out, his voice carrying a forced casualness. Chris turned to look, and the smirk on his face slowly disappeared, replaced by something closer to shock. Luke, the youngest, had his mouth slightly open, clearly not expecting Ava to arrive the way she did, looking confident, powerful, and above all, untouchable. "Hello, boys," Ava said, her voice cool as she approached them. "I hope I'd not underdressed for the occasion." There was a pause, just long enough for the tension to settle over them, before Brandon regained his composure, a fake smile plastered across his face. "Not at all, Ava. You look surprising," he said, though his eyes betrayed the annoyance simmering beneath the surface. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "The party's just getting started. Make yourself at home." Ava walked past them, her expression neutral, but inside she was savoring the moment. She could tell that they had expected her to arrive meekly, unprepared, maybe even alone. Instead, she had shattered their expectations, and she intended to keep doing so. The mansion's interior was even grander than Ava had imagined. Polished marble floors, chandeliers hanging from high ceilings, and walls adorned with artwork that seemed more like museum pieces. Music thumped through the large rooms, a mix of pop and electronic beats, while waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays of drinks. Ava moved through the party, ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow her. She could feel the eyes of Brandon, Chris, and Luke on her from across the room, as if they were waiting for her to falter, to make some mistake they could capitalize on. But Ava wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She made her way to the bar, ordering herself a sparkling water, and took a moment to survey the scene. She saw Rachel across the room, sneaking in unnoticed to support her. Rachel gave Ava a quick thumbs up, her eyes twinkling with excitement, and Ava couldn't help but smile. Knowing her friend was there made her feel stronger, more grounded. Enjoying the party? A voice interrupted her thoughts. Ava turned to find Brandon standing beside her, his gaze fixed on her. He had a casual air about him, but Ava could sense the tension in his posture, the tightness around his eyes, the way he gripped his drink just a little too firmly. "It's nice," Ava replied evenly, taking a sip of her water. "Thanks for inviting me." Brandon's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know, Ava, I have to admit, I didn't expect you to come. I mean, you in this kind of crowd, it's not exactly what I'd call a natural fit." Ava met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You'd be surprised what fits me, Brandon," she said. "I'm full of surprises." Brandon chuckled, though there was a hardness behind the sound. "So it seems, but you know, this isn't really your scene. I mean, look around." He gestured to the crowd, the groups of wealthy students laughing, the designer dresses and expensive watches flashing in the dim light. These are people who've grown up with this. It's in their blood. Ava arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "You mean people who were born lucky?" she asked. "Because from what I see, that doesn't really mean much. It's easy to stand here and look the part when you haven't had to fight for anything." Brandon's smile froze, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Ava could see she had struck a nerve. Before he could respond, she turned her back on him, walking away with her drink in hand, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her, the tension crackling in the air between them, the turning of the tables. As the night wore on, Ava made her way through the crowd, her confidence growing with every step. She spoke with a few students. Some were polite, some were curious, but none were hostile. The whispers that had trailed her upon her arrival had now turned into admiration and intrigue. Ava noticed the way people looked at her, not as the out-of-place scholarship student, but as someone who had captured their attention. She had just started to relax when she noticed Chris and Luke standing near the entrance to the garden, their heads bent together in conversation, their eyes darting toward her every so often. Ava narrowed her eyes, her instincts screaming that something was about to happen. Suddenly, the music cut off, replaced by the sound of clinking glass. Ava turned to see Brandon standing on the staircase, a champagne flute in hand, a smug smile on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," he called out, his voice echoing through the grand hall. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned to him. Ava felt her stomach twist, knowing this was the moment they had been waiting for, the trap she had been anticipating. "I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight," Brandon continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd until they landed on Ava, a gleam of malice behind his smile. "And a special welcome to our dear Ava Wilson, who, I must say, has surprised us all by showing up in style." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Ava could feel the tension rising. Brandon was setting her up, trying to create a moment that would humiliate her, to strip away the confidence she had shown all night. "But you know, Ava," Brandon said, his tone dripping with false sincerity, "I've been wondering, what's your secret? I mean, we all know that people like us, we have certain privileges. But you, well, you've always seemed to be different. So how did you manage to get here tonight? The car, the dress. It's almost like you're trying to be something you're not." The room seemed to hold its breath, all eyes shifting to Ava. She could feel the weight of their stares, the anticipation for her reaction. Brandon stood at the top of the stairs, his smile widening, confident that he had her cornered. Ava took a deep breath, then slowly stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She looked up at Brandon, her gaze steady, her expression calm. "You want to know my secret, Brandon?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. "It's pretty simple. I don't let people like you define me." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Ava could see Brandon's confident smile falter, his eyes narrowing. "You see, I don't need privilege or wealth to be here tonight," Ava continued, her voice strong. "I've earned everything I have through hard work, through perseverance. And unlike some people, I don't need to bring others down to make myself feel important." There was a beat of silence, then another, before someone in the crowd let out a soft cheer, followed by another and another. Ava could see Rachel beaming at her from across the room, clapping her hands, and soon enough, the applause spread, echoing through the grand hall. Brandon stood frozen, his face flushed, his eyes darkening as he looked down at Ava. But she didn't care. The power he had tried to wield over her was gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. Ava turned away, the applause ringing in her ears as she walked back into the crowd. Her heart pounding but her head held high. She had faced their trap, and she had won. She had turned their game against them, and now they were the ones left scrambling. A father's arrival. Later in the evening, as the party continued, Ava saw the familiar gleam of headlights through the large windows of the mansion's front room. She knew it was time. Her father, Adrian, had promised to pick her up, and she knew he would be waiting. She moved through the crowd, her confidence unwavering, when she noticed Luke's parents standing by the entrance, their eyes lighting up when they saw her approaching with Adrian. "Mr. Wilson," Luke's mother exclaimed, extending a hand to Adrian, her smile warm. "It's such a pleasure to see you here. Ava, my dear, you look absolutely stunning tonight." Adrian shook hands with them, his eyes glancing at Ava with pride. "Thank you for hosting this wonderful party. It means a lot that Ava was welcomed so warmly." Ava glanced towards Brandon, Chris, and Luke, who were standing in the corner, their expressions a mix of anger, confusion, and regret. They watched as their parents greeted Ava's father with respect, as Ava herself was treated not as an outsider, but as someone worthy of admiration. In that moment, Ava knew she had won. Whatever game Brandon, Chris, and Luke had intended to play, she had beaten them, not by sinking to their level, but by rising above it. She was no longer the scholarship student they thought they could break. She was Ava Wilson, a force they could never have anticipated. As the night drew to a close, Ava left with her father, her heart filled with a newfound sense of strength. The whispers of her classmates echoed behind her, not in mockery but in admiration. She had faced the trio on their own turf, and she had emerged victorious. She had shown them all that she was more than what they thought. She was unstoppable. And no matter what lay ahead, Ava knew she was ready. The night had reached its peak, the mansion bustling with laughter and music. Brandon, Chris, and Luke had slunk to the edges of the gathering, their eyes following Ava as she moved through the room, smiling and engaging with others. The confidence with which Ava carried herself, her elegance, and the way she commanded attention had rattled them more than they would admit. They had planned to make a spectacle of her, one that would humiliate her in front of the wealthiest students in the university. But instead, it seemed like the tables had turned, and Ava was the center of admiration. Brandon was growing more agitated by the moment. He stood by the staircase, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming restlessly on the banister. "How the hell did this happen?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ava. She moved with a calm grace, her smile genuine, her poise unwavering. Everything about her seemed to defy the narrative Brandon had written for her. Luke, who stood beside Brandon, shifted nervously. "Maybe we should just let it go, Brandon. She's not what we thought." Brandon shot him an irritated glance. "No, we can't just let it go. She thinks she can just walk in here and—" But whatever Brandon was about to say was cut short by the sound of the grand double doors opening. The murmurs of the crowd hushed, and heads turned toward the entrance. Ava paused, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the familiar figure stepping into the room. It was Adrian Wilson, her father. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Despite the suit, there was something unmistakably commanding about his presence, his posture, his steady gait, the way his eyes scanned the room before finding Ava. He moved with a quiet confidence, a presence that spoke of someone who had faced danger and come out stronger on the other side. Ava felt a surge of warmth in her chest. Her father was here, as he had promised. She began making her way across the room toward him, the crowd parting as if instinctively sensing the significance of the moment. As Adrian entered, Luke's parents, Deborah and Charles, were the first to approach him. Deborah's eyes widened in recognition, her lips parting in surprise before a broad smile crossed her face. She moved forward, extending her hand to Adrian. "Adrian Wilson," Deborah exclaimed, her voice carrying through the room. "It's been ages. What a wonderful surprise to see you here. And this must be your lovely daughter, Ava." She glanced at Ava, her expression one of genuine warmth. Brandon, Chris, and Luke watched from the other side of the room, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Brandon's face twisted into a frown, his eyes darting between Adrian and Ava as if trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Adrian smiled politely, shaking Deborah's hand. "Good to see you, Deborah, Charles," he said, his eyes flicking to Ava, softening as they met hers. "Yes, Ava is my daughter. I've heard a lot about this party, and I must say, it's quite the event." Deborah turned toward Ava, her voice dripping with admiration. "Ava, my dear, you look absolutely stunning. And the way you've carried yourself tonight. It's been a pleasure having you here." Adrian placed a gentle hand on Ava's shoulder, his pride evident in the way he looked at her. Ava smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She had walked into this party alone, but now, standing beside her father, she felt invincible. Across the room, Brandon's eyes widened, his mind racing. Adrian Wilson. The name now carried weight. He remembered his father mentioning Adrian, about how he was a self-made man who had not only survived but thrived after facing unimaginable hardship. The rumors about Ava's father being a disabled veteran who struggled to make ends meet were suddenly shattered, replaced by the image of a man who stood proud and composed, respected by those whose approval Brandon craved. A whispered revelation. Luke leaned in toward Brandon, his voice a low whisper. "I think I heard my dad talking about him before. Adrian Wilson owns a bunch of car dealerships. He's a Marine vet, and apparently he's done really well for himself." Brandon felt a hot flush creep up his neck. He had thought Ava was an easy target, someone with no power, no connections, someone he could dismiss. He had assumed she came from nothing. But the truth was far from what he had imagined. He watched as his parents approached Ava, shaking her father's hand, expressing their admiration. The respect in their voices was undeniable, and it twisted Brandon's gut. Chris nudged Brandon, his eyes wide, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he whispered, "Guess we've messed this one up, huh?" Brandon shot him a glare, but Chris wasn't wrong. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. Instead of humiliating Ava, they had inadvertently elevated her, brought her into a circle of admiration that none of them had anticipated. Ava's triumph. Ava stood beside her father as he spoke with Deborah and Charles, her heart swelling with pride. She had known her father was respected, but seeing the admiration in their eyes, seeing the way people looked at him, as though he were someone they wanted to impress, was something else entirely. As the small group around them began to grow, more people joining in to speak to Adrian, Ava caught sight of Brandon, Chris, and Luke standing at the far end of the room. She could see the expressions on their faces, confusion, frustration, something close to embarrassment. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her. Ava turned her gaze away from them, focusing on her father, on the warmth of his presence beside her. This night had started as a challenge, a trap she had knowingly walked into. But now, standing here, surrounded by people who saw her for who she was, not just as someone to be bullied or broken, Ava felt victorious. The music had resumed, a slow melody filling the space, and Ava felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see her father looking at her, his eyes twinkling. "May I have this dance?" Adrian asked, his voice soft, his smile warm. Ava smiled, nodding. "Of course, Dad." He led her to the dance floor, and as they moved together in time with the music, Ava could feel the tension in her chest slowly unwinding. She had faced the challenge, had walked into the lion's den, and she had emerged stronger. Adrian looked down at her, his eyes filled with pride. "I knew you could do it, Ava," he said quietly. "I knew you had it in you to face them." Ava looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I didn't do it alone, Dad. You've always been my strength." Adrian smiled, pulling her closer as they continued to dance. Around them, the party continued, but Ava felt as though it was just the two of them, moving in sync, her father's strength and love wrapping around her like armor. Brandon's frustration. From across the room, Brandon watched as Ava danced with her father, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. Everything had gone wrong. The carefully laid plans, the setup, the trap, all of it had backfired. And now Ava was the one everyone was talking about, the one everyone admired. Luke shifted nervously beside him, clearing his throat. Maybe we should just let it go, Brandon. I mean, we don't need to make it worse. Brandon shot him a glare, his jaw tightening. No, she made a fool of us tonight. We can't just. But even as he spoke, he knew Luke was right. There was nothing more they could do. Ava had won, not just by standing up to them, but by showing them what true strength looked like. And the worst part? Everyone knew it. Chris let out a sigh, shaking his head. Man, we really underestimated her. Brandon stayed silent, his eyes locked on Ava, the frustration and bitterness roiling inside him. He had lost this battle, and he knew it. But as he watched Ava smile up at her father, a part of him, buried beneath the anger, couldn't help but feel something else, something he couldn't quite name. Was it admiration? Was it envy? Whatever it was, it gnawed at him, refusing to let him forget how wrong he had been. The night ends. As the night began to wind down, Ava and Adrian made their way to the entrance, where the Bentley was waiting. Ava turned to look at the house one last time, her eyes meeting Brandon's from across the room. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then turned away, stepping into the car beside her father. As the Bentley pulled away, Ava leaned back in her seat, a smile playing on her lips. She had faced her fears, had confronted the boys who had tried to make her feel small, and she had won. She had done it not by becoming what they expected, but by being herself, by standing tall and refusing to be intimidated. And as the car drove away, Ava knew this was just the beginning. The challenges would keep coming, but she was ready. With her family by her side, with her father's strength behind her, Ava Wilson knew she could face anything. The Monday after the party felt different. There was a shift in the atmosphere of Northbridge University, an unspoken tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. As Ava walked across the quad to her first class, she could feel the curious glances, hear the hushed whispers, and sense the subtle nods of acknowledgement from students who, only days earlier, might have dismissed her as just another scholarship student. She wasn't sure if it was respect, admiration, or simply curiosity, but it was clear that something had changed. Word about the party had spread fast. The scholarship girl who had arrived at Luke's mansion in a Bentley, her adoptive father turning out to be a respected Marine veteran and a successful businessman. It was a story that captivated the student body. And then there was her calm and confident takedown of Brandon's attempt to humiliate her, a moment that had rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. It was no longer just a story about Ava Wilson, the underdog. It had become a narrative about resilience and strength that no one could ignore. Brandon's realization. In contrast, Brandon Lockwood sat in the back of his economics lecture, unable to focus on the professor's words. His mind kept drifting back to the party, to the look in Ava's eyes as she had stood before him, unafraid, and had turned the tables on him without so much as flinching. It wasn't just the embarrassment that gnawed at him. It was the realization that he had completely underestimated her. Brandon had always been taught that people like Ava, those who didn't have wealth, connections, or social standing, were different, lesser. It was a belief that had been ingrained in him since childhood, reinforced by his parents and their friends, and he had never questioned it. But Ava had shattered that belief in a single night. The respect she had commanded, the way she had faced him down, even the admiration she had garnered from people like his own parents, it all clashed violently with the assumptions Brandon had held onto for so long. He felt something he hadn't expected, an uncomfortable pang of guilt. He knew, deep down, that he had been wrong. He had treated Ava as if she were nothing, tried to bring her down for no reason other than his own ego. And in the process, he had revealed a side of himself that he was no longer proud of. The confrontation. Brandon's thoughts lingered on Ava throughout the day, and by the time his last lecture ended, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed to face Ava, to admit his mistake, and to try, somehow, to make things right. He found her in the library later that afternoon, sitting at a table near the back, her nose buried in a textbook. For a moment, Brandon hesitated, his nerves getting the better of him. He had never apologized like this before, never had to admit he was wrong in a way that truly mattered. But there was something about the look in Ava's eyes that night, something about the way she had stood her ground, that made him feel like he owed her at least this much. He took a deep breath and approached her table, clearing his throat softly. Ava looked up, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. For a second, she said nothing, just stared at him, clearly wary. "Ava," Brandon began, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the arrogance it usually carried. "I was hoping I could talk to you. If you don't mind." Ava eyed him, her guard still up. She closed her book slowly, folding her hands over it, her expression unreadable. "What do you want, Brandon?" she asked, her tone steady, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. Brandon shifted awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to apologize for everything," he said, meeting her gaze. "The things I said, the way I treated you, it was wrong. I shouldn't have done any of it." Ava raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what brought this on?" she asked, her voice skeptical. Brandon swallowed, his gaze dropping for a moment before he forced himself to meet her eyes again. "The party. The way you stood up to me. It made me realize just how wrong I've been about everything. About you. I've been an ass, Ava. And I get it if you don't want to accept my apology, but I needed to say it." Ava watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. Finally, she let out a sigh, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "You were an ass," she said, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "But you're right about one thing. You needed to apologize. And I appreciate that you did." Brandon felt a small sense of relief, his heart lifting just a little. He knew it wasn't enough, that it wouldn't erase everything he had done, but it was a start. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ava nodded, her expression softening. "Look, Brandon, I get it. We come from different worlds, and I know you've probably been taught to see people like me in a certain way, but maybe it's time you started seeing people for who they are, not just where they come from." Brandon nodded, her words sinking in. "You're right, and I want to do better. I want to be better." Ava studied him for a moment longer before finally giving him a small smile. "Good. Then prove it." Chris and Luke. Later that day, Brandon found Chris and Luke sitting on the steps outside one of the main buildings. They looked up as he approached, and Chris raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour." "What's up, Brandon?" Brandon took a deep breath, sitting down beside them. "I talked to Ava," he said, his voice even. "I apologized." Chris's smirk faltered, and he exchanged a glance with Luke, who looked surprised. "You apologized?" Chris asked, his tone incredulous. "Yeah," Brandon said. "I realized we were wrong. About Ava, about everything. We treated her like crap for no reason other than our own stupid egos. She's stronger than any of us, and we tried to bring her down just because we thought we could." Luke shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his hands. He had always followed Brandon and Chris, always been the one to laugh along, even when he knew it wasn't right. But now, hearing Brandon admit it, he felt a pang of guilt of his own. "You're right," Luke said quietly. "We were wrong." Chris let out a sigh, running a hand over his face. "Damn it, Brandon. I hate when you get all introspective," he muttered, but there was no real heat behind his words. He looked away, his smirk replaced by something more serious. "But yeah, I guess you're right. We were jerks." Brandon looked at them both, his expression earnest. "It's not just about Ava. We've treated a lot of people like crap. Maybe it's time we stopped." There was a long pause, the weight of Brandon's words hanging between them. Finally, Chris nodded, a resigned smile tugging at his lips. All right, man. I guess if you're turning over a new leaf, we should too. Luke nodded, a small smile on his face. Yeah, let's do better. A new beginning. The next few weeks were strange for Ava. The dynamic had shifted, not just between her and Brandon, Chris, and Luke, but with the entire student body. The trio no longer made snide comments as she walked past. There were no more whispered insults, no more deliberate attempts to embarrass her. Instead, there was a tentative sense of respect. One afternoon, as Ava was leaving her economics lecture, she found Brandon, Chris, and Luke waiting by the door. They looked nervous, their postures awkward, and for a moment, Ava's guard went up. But Brandon stepped forward, offering her a small, almost sheepish smile. "Hey, Ava," he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "We were wondering if you'd like to join us for lunch. Start over. Maybe even be friends?" Ava studied them, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to gauge their sincerity. She could see the nervousness in their eyes, the way they shifted under her gaze. It wasn't easy for them, admitting they had been wrong, trying to make amends. And though Ava knew it would take time to trust them, she could also see that they were trying. She let out a small sigh, then nodded. "All right, but if you ever pull any of that crap again, I'm out." Brandon grinned, relief washing over his face. "Deal." As they walked together toward the cafeteria, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. She had faced her fears, had stood up to the people who had tried to tear her down. And now, they were trying to make things right. It wasn't perfect. It would take time for trust to be built. But it was a start. Ava had always believed in the power of resilience, in standing up for herself, in fighting for her place. And now, as she walked beside the very people who had once tried to break her, she knew that she had not only earned her place at Northbridge, she had redefined it.